Good morning, everybody. Very warm welcome to our global talks. Let me start our session by underlining that we acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Song peoples whose historical relationship with this land continues to this day. With this acknowledgement, I would like to welcome our guest here, Laurie Tarlaxon, who joins us from the University of Alberta. And she has been, you might have heard in the hallways at the center, she has been generous enough to offer her expertise to evaluate and review our European Studies program that is housed at the center. So over the past 2 days, we had a grueling array of meetings and we'll write down the reports, but thank you very much for doing this, Laurie. It's wonderful to be able to rely on your expertise, but you can see also how Laurie herself brings a lot of expertise in the field of European studies to the University of Alberta, but also to us here. She graduated and received her PhD from the London School of Economics, and then worked at the University of Nottingham and was a Jean Monnet fellow at the European University Institute in Florence. We just spoke about this, and you can see you can see that she continued her engagement in Italy by being a coordinator of the faculty school in Cortona as well. So we will hear about these opportunities even for undergraduates at UVic, as I just heard from Laurie. Dr. Tarlaxon is an expert really on party competition and representation in multi-level systems. So looking at federal systems, the European Union, and comparing and by looking at party organizations, party system change and voter behavior across Europe and Canada to a certain extent. And you can see here her last book, 2020, with Oxford University Press, which looks at multi-level democracy. So thinking that's for this Europe is a wonderful example, right? Across different levels of governments, how democratic practices evolve, but also you've looked at the issue of populism, the current challenges to democracy. Unfortunately, we won't hear much about this research, but there's another line of research that you can see here that Laurie has with looking at energy transitions, right? And that is you have some funded research, and we are really interested in these political issues that, in particular at the moment, energy security, energy transition with respect to climate change, but also the energy insecurity due to the Russian war in Ukraine, is very on everybody's mind. So it's wonderful that you can present on this today. So Laurie, again, very warm welcome to the center, and the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you very much. I will share my screen. So what a pleasure to be here, and I've just had a wonderful few days leading up to this, having an opportunity to review the European Studies program. I feel like I know you fairly well, and now I'm getting my introduction to the your group as well. I want to start by just saying a few words about how I got to this research. As Oliver said, I've most of the work that I've done before this was looking at parties, party competition. But I've always been very interested in the idea of the dimensionality of conflict, patterns of opposition, and how this evolves over time. And I started my career at the University of Nottingham about the time when I moved to Canada, which was 2008. I remember seeing a headline, Financial Times. It's in the weekend edition. It was an article about the oil sands in Fort McMurray, and the headline was, "This is the greatest environmental crime on earth?" And I thought, wow, a business press making, a newspaper that represents economic elites in the UK is looking at Fort McMurray and, calling it in the headline an environmental crime. If at that same time, if you looked in Canada, you look into the Harvard cabinet and still find people who are publicly questioning the reality of climate change and finds climate change. But this is wild, how there are these different worlds that people inhabit. And so, that kind of that planted the seed for this, this interest that I have in what is essentially what I'll talk about today, which is research about framing. It's about how the worlds that we inhabit develop, how they shift, and how they shift over time. So this research, which I've conducted with colleagues at the University of Calgary, and it's funded by the Future Energy Systems at the University of Alberta and a similar program at the University of Calgary. It's part of a broader project that aims to understand the politics of climate change and climate policy. And a lot of our work has to do with public opinion, and we're trying to understand how our feelings and our identities shape our support for energy transition and climate policy. But we're also very interested in how we respond to elite cues and how these shape our cognition and our decision making. So this piece of the research kind of starts from the other side, and it looks at elite messaging, and what we're looking at is how economic stakeholders, the economic elites, and in this case, we're looking at publicly listed corporations, how they talk about climate-related risk, and how this, how we might see shifts both across time. So in this case, from 2013 to 2019, and also across industries and across jurisdictions, because we're comparing firms that are listed in Canadian stock markets, American, and European. And we're looking at 5 different industries. So why are we looking at this? And why are we looking at firms? Well, we hold that firms are central actors in the politics of climate change, because economy-wide decarbonization has deep economic implications. Industry is in a position both to do great harm, it's recent from the past, and research has uncovered some of the, that industry and their lobbying has done to try to obfuscate messages, to delay, to block climate policies, and to convince for a long time to try to convince the public that there's nothing to see here, folks, that nothing's going on. But industry is also in the position to drive forward solutions. So we feel it's quite important to understand how industry talks about climate policy. They have enormous lobbying power, and they also have the potential to mobilize resources and investments and drive decisions by industry and drive innovation. Business narratives as well have been quite central to the politics of climate change, and there's quite a body of work that's looked at how this discourse around the economy environment trade-off has really shaped the politics of climate policy over the past few years. And so we can see it even now, not only in the past over debates that were centered on climate change denial, but even today we can see it whenever a phrase like job-killing carbon tax pops up. And so this is a very central economic narrative. So we feel it's quite important to look at firms. And so why is their discourse important? And how are we understanding the discourse of firms? Because the other thing is that, and I think events over the past few months have shown us that you really can't necessarily take what firms say at face value. There's an enormous amount of greenwashing. And so this is where we want to be quite careful about what we're doing. And so we want to be clear that what we're not measuring here is some indication of what firms are actually doing. But even if they are greenwashing, even if they are making these lovely claims and not following through, we still regard that as important. We see the language that they use as a form of strategic framing. There are choices behind them. It's a choice to phrase their position on climate policies in a particular way. And the source text that we draw upon, which are their corporate annual reports, it's a form of public and investor framing discourse, and it is a form of deliberate, strategic, and symbolic communication. So we're focusing on that. It is not the same thing as climate action. And to be clear, we're not measuring what they're actually doing. We're measuring how they talk about it. And I think how they talk about climate change, even if they're not following through, can still be important. It has the potential to shape public debate, the potential to shape the issue dimensionality. So for example, to shift the meaning when we talk about economic environmental trade-offs, it can shift that a little bit. It shapes the problem definition. that gets out there in the policy making process. It has the potential to shape and change discursive coalitions who might be able to partner up and find themselves on the same side of an argument for an issue. It shapes the definition of potential policy solutions as well as the trade-offs that might be included in those and patterns of opposition. So it's this that we're really after. We're trying to see how changes in the language, even if it's greenwash, even if they're just pretty words, might nevertheless signal some important potential political shifts that open the door for a new type of politics, a new type of coalition. And so, for example, there has been some recent research conducted out of U of T on that has traced shifts in changing economic framing of that economic environmental trade-off. That's mostly looked at media coverage. We don't know whether and how that also holds true to the way that firms are talking about that. But if we see some of the similar patterns in firms, that potentially is quite important, we think, for the possibilities for climate politics and policymaking. So it's really research that is about framing and how firms frame the way we talk about climate-related risk. And so in this research, we're drawing from two different disciplines to understand framing. And so one approach comes from psychology, from the pioneering work of Kahneman and Tversky. And this really focuses on the differences in the way, how differences in the way that information is presented to us affects the way that we process it and the decisions that are made. And so framing doesn't always change the content of our beliefs, doesn't always seek to persuade us and change your mind about something, but it might change the way that your brain processes this. So for example, Oliver mentioned energy security. And so some framing dimension might be if you try to link an issue such as climate with security, it might shift your decision making because suddenly you rely on all of the heuristics that you have already developed and attached to security. There's been other research that talks about the value. STOXX has published research that's talked about the value of building broader coalitions by linking the climate of doing climate policies to social policy and quality jobs and social policy. And this changes the way that we process this. And so, also from psychology, research comes on how the sources of credibility can change the way that we process information. So we're drawing inspiration from this literature. We use the psychological approach quite a lot in our other research where we use experiments to test how people respond to different messages about climate and we vary the source. But for this paper, we draw quite heavily as well on sociological approaches to framing, which approach the idea of framing from a more constructivist and interpretivist way. And so they try to seek to understand how frames are a type of a negotiated shared meaning. And so how frames and the way that they endure reflect and shape our perceptions of the world around us. And so this sort of takes me back to that moment of looking at that Financial Times headline and thinking, wow, do these economic elites in different places occupy completely different worlds? The things that they see when they look at climate, when they look at these debates are completely different. So for us, the framing of climate discourse by business elites is important because we feel also it might serve as a causal step in policy shifts, especially when the government is attuned to business interests. So we want to understand what these meanings are, what these frames are, and how they shift over time. And there are different expectations that we might have. If we look at what's happened over time, might we expect framing to have changed? Well, I think just generally, the world has become more aware of and alarmed about this problem of climate change that is inescapable, we would expect to see greater salience all around. But we can also look at, try to predict maybe some more specific impacts. And so, first of all, we can expect some sort of impact from elevated litigation risk. And this is kind of an interesting category for us because it's kind of ambiguous. We can operate in a couple of different directions. So litigation risk, and especially in North, is something that we find operating especially strongly in North America, or at least for a longer time in North America. It comes from two main sources. So one is the risk of litigation related to securities fraud. Seeing this in the United States and more recently Canada as well. And this is, and so in the United States and in New York and California, and the Securities and Exchange Commission as well has undertaken legal action against firms for failing to fully disclose their climate-related risks. This is quite interesting because we would expect this to then increase the amount of discourse and the amount of climate-related risk disclosures that we would expect to find in company reports as companies try to cover their butts and make sure that they disclose the risk to their shareholders so that they can't get sued by saying, you never told us, you never disclosed this risk. But on the other side, there's a countervailing pressure from another type of litigation, and that are class action lawsuits from litigators who seek to hold companies responsible for the climate harm that they impose on society. And so here the pressure runs the other way. We'd expect companies to try to keep very quiet and try to limit what they say about their linking that might link their activities to greenhouse gas emissions and then to climate harms. And so you've got different pressures here. So it's really not clear what we would expect to prevail here. But that's one source of pressure here. We also have stakeholder pressure, which we would expect generally to be changing over time. And so this is pressure from both customers as well as investors. So and we know from public opinion surveys that even if the policies that our governments enact do not reflect this, that publics are becoming more concerned about climate and more supportive of climate policies. So we would expect businesses, and depending especially on the type of business they're in, to become aware of these changing preferences and demand from their customers and to respond accordingly. And shareholders as well can incentivize their companies to emphasize their commitments to climate goals. And we've seen a wave of action recently by activist investors, proxy battles that seek to, for example, change the composition of boards in order to pressure a company to move toward and to adopt a more meaningful climate action. So we've also seen, however, there's research that's found that there is a self-serving bias in environmental disclosures that might to compensate for weak environmental performance. And so if you are a company and you perceive that you're facing these pressures, this might then lead you to inflate your language. We talk a lot about climate, we're so concerned about it, very committed to it. And with the hope that if your words sound great enough, then it might, even if you can't deliver, then it might take the pressure off in the face of these pressures from stakeholders. And then finally, we would expect institutional pressures to gradually be shifting the way that we talk about and report climate related risk. And this can happen through much more direct mechanisms. So especially if we look at the European Union, where there are more stricter climate related risk reporting requirements and climate related reporting requirements than in North American regulatory frameworks. We would expect that to lead to an increase in climate related risk language in these reports, frankly, but also through an indirect mechanism where it's gradually shifting the norms and culture of these boards. And then finally, accountancy frameworks can play an important role, especially for climate-related risk disclosures, where the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures or the Sustainability Accounting Standards Boards have and in Canada, the Canadian Securities Administrators have introduced templates and guidelines to actually guide these companies on how to talk about and disclose their climate-related risk. So this is, it's, you know, in a nutshell, those are some of the pressures that we expect to be operating. What we're doing here is we decided to look at annual reports, and so we've looked at 600 annual reports from companies from 5 different industries. So we're looking at companies in energy, industrials, utilities, financial, consumer discretionary, and 2 different time periods, 2013 and 2009, so crucially before and after the Paris Agreement. And we wanted to try to understand how the way that they talk about climate-related risk is changing over time. And so this sample gives us the possibility to compare geographically, temporally, and across industries, because we expect different industries to be facing different pressures. So we developed a coding frame based on a sociological approach to framing, which I'll talk about in a minute. It's an exploratory approach. So we've used a guide. We developed a coding frame, using standard categories that researchers on framing typically adopt, went to the literature to elaborate these, to figure out what particular elements we would expect these to include, and then adjusted these inductively with a small sample of reports to develop a final frame. So with these, for the data that I'm presenting today, it's reporting on the results of hand-coded reports from a sample of 150 of those. And then we supplemented that with a textual analysis of the full 600 set of reports to get some measure of salience. And so we're using hierarchical cluster analysis, which is a form of exploratory data analysis. What it allows us to do is to take all of this masses of data, which we've coded within these reports, where we find different frame elements occurring. And then by applying the hierarchical cluster analysis, it lets us see which of these frame elements cluster together. So we're not imposing frames of meaning on the data. We're letting the data tell us what frames of meaning emerge out of this. So what I'll present to you in a few minutes is how these topics cluster so that it's clustered so that it maximizes the similarity of topics within each grouping. So as we developed this, we had to start with some sort of coding frame. So this is how we did it. So drawing on Edmund's approaches to framing, we started out with these broad categories of context frame elements, moral frame elements, action frame elements. And then from the literature, we added a few other general categories of risk frames and other frames. And working with some reports, adjusted them to fill them out. So we are coding frame in the context categories, where we're trying to identify some of the general features of the policy background of the world that these firms seem to perceive around them as they talk about climate-related risks. These include acknowledgement of climate change to begin with, acknowledgement of energy transition, the context of policy occurring within a broader international union, or whether it's quite narrow. So do companies talk about or make reference to UN goals or Paris Agreement or other broader structures, such as the task force on climate-related financial disclosure. And so do they see themselves as part of the broader world? In the moral frame, this includes the urgency and the importance of climate policy, how committed they are to carbon reduction. So the justification that they attach and the extent to which they elevate the importance of climate action in their annual reports, because there are some companies that will headline their entire annual report with the challenges of climate change. This was quite interesting where we found somewhere that they would identify key transformations in the world of digital transition and climate change. And so this is the section of the coding frame that picks up on that. The risk frame it does not come from it, but we wanted to include that. And this is the frame that tries to identify the elements of climate-related risks that firms perceive. And so whether or not, and so these are the elements of climate-related risk that kind of tap into that obligation to report climate-related risks under accountancy frameworks. And so this is quite interesting to us because it includes elements that such as whether or not climate policies are a risk to them, possible assets, stranded assets, whether or not climate change itself is perceived as the risk. So those are some of the frame elements in that. Action frames include specific actions or goals that the firm declares to have undertaken, including carbon reduction goals, whether or not these are firm targets or soft targets. Also, actions including changes in their organizational units, whether they have created committee or structure in their organization to monitor and report on progress towards climate-related goals, divestment actions, memberships in external bodies as well. And then finally, we've incorporated some other elements, including technological optimism, because this was quite an important element that emerged from the literature. And I think it's quite an interesting element that's shaping debate. So whether or not, it's not only whether or not firms perceive there to be an economic opportunity in energy transition, but also language that relates to a sense of optimism about the possibility of progress and technological development and their own strategic ability and advantage in this area as well. And so whether or not their strength is in research and development, as well as adversarial framing. And we found this didn't fit well into the others, and so we've included, we were alert for instances where firms talked about climate policy and climate change in terms of facing opposition from consumers, their customers, environmental groups, or government. So when we did this analysis to find out how these various items that were in the coding frame actually clustered together, and so how they combined, we found that 5 main frames emerged. And so the first 3 frames, the energy transition optimism frame, the moral commitment to climate change, and the cost of climate change in a changing world, are all 3 frames which are the most supportive of climate policy, climate action, and of energy transition policies. And so the first one that we identified was an energy transition optimism frame. And so this includes items of, first of all, looking around the world and seeing transformation underway. And that was quite important. It's how you see the world. Is it business as usual, or are we in the midst of some transformation and actions needed? And so this one includes a sense of transformation coupled with a sense that there is an economic opportunity here. It's also combined with technological optimism, and so firms that also talk about their capability to respond. And so often this tends to be in industries that have higher levels of research and development. And this frame also included some interesting action frame items, including firm level carbon goals. And so we tended to see in this frame specific steps being announced. And I say announced rather than taken, just to remind you that we're not monitoring whether they actually followed up. A second frame that emerges is a strong moral commitment to climate action. So seeing climate change as an important problem. Also, we see in this is an endorsement of the international framework. So companies that are aware that they're working in the framework of the Paris Agreement or with other organizations. We see in this frame, we also see divestment as an action frame, which suggests that that it's not completely greenwash. If they're announcing divestments to their shareholders, that they're actually, some of them at least, are coupling these high sentiments with some action. And coupling also with organizational level firm change. So the creation at board level, or reporting to board, of units in their organization that report on climate progress. And so that was quite interesting to us. What was interesting here as well is that when this frame that emerges also includes an identification of a climate risk as a risk stemming from a failure to innovate. So our business is at risk if we fail to adapt to changing times. And that was quite interesting as well. The third frame, also supportive of climate action, is costs of climate change in a changing world. And so this is when the climate risks are associated with climate change rather than with climate policies. So this is a smaller frame, but it emerged from it as a distinct one. Frames 4 and 5 are not supportive, are the least supportive of climate action and climate change. And so frame number 4, the cost of climate policy, is one that perpetuates traditional opposition, traditional business opposition, and perpetuates this traditional line of there being an economy-environment trade-off. And so this frame emphasizes the costs of regulation to business. It emphasizes the impacts of climate action and climate regulations, government climate regulations on earnings, and emphasizes the risks of litigation that firms might face related to lack of action on climate. And then finally, in the quite a small frame, is one that we call silent skepticism and opposition. It was quite rare that we'd find firms that were openly dismissive of climate change. They certainly did appear in our sample. They tended to be smaller companies. They tended to be in the United States, and they tended to be in 2013. And we've seen a shift since then. And one thing that does happen over time with these is what we've seen the pro-climate frames strengthen over time. The nature of oppositional frames has changed. So from the 2013 to 2019, we see that skepticism really drops out. People, so the nature of opposition changes. You rarely see from 2013 to 2019, that last frame, open opposition or open skepticism about the reality of climate change. But instead, we tend to see more silence, and we see instead a strengthening of the fourth frame, which is the cost of climate policy. And so an emphasis on, okay, we're being forced to do these things, or these new regulations are coming online, and it's going to be costly for us, and it's going to hit our earnings. And we don't find in those frames a sense that there's an opportunity in here for our firms. So in a very general sense, overall, we, as we'd expect, concern about climate change grows over that decade that we're looking at, and we see that a strengthening of these pro-climate frames. We see also that the moral frame is stronger for European-based companies, and so I think we can interpret that in lots of different ways, but I would suggest that it's, or suspect that it is, the result of a regulatory culture that maybe at an early stage shaped norms and shaped language, and led to the generation of sort of conversations that were happening at board level in European firms compared to the North American firms. We also noted that when looking at some of these frame elements, we took representative variables for some of these frames and analyzed those, and found that in Europe as well, the response to climate change was much more likely to be perceived to be an economic opportunity for firms compared to North American firms. Whereas in North America, we're much more likely to see language that emphasizes climate policies as an economic cost. Now, it's not terribly surprising, given, especially in the United States, the effectiveness of lobbying efforts to portray climate policies as an economic cost. Now, that framing and the clustering identifies the types of language that fits together. It doesn't really tell us much about frequency and salience. And so we also used some automated textual analysis to analyze the frequency of certain sets of words. And so we had some bigrams of words associated with climate, with climate and technological developments, and climate and socio-political dimensions, environment, climate, as well as climate and science. I want to draw your attention to the yellow bars on here, because these are words from a dictionary that are most closely related to core climate policy: sustainable climate, recycled material, greenhouse gas, renewable sources, climate change. And this chart's letting you see what's happening over time, so from 2013 to 2019, but also across different regions. So we can see, actually quite surprisingly for Canada, we see quite a huge increase in the prevalence of climate-related discussion. And so an increase from 0.39 to 0.65 in this. And that's, I have to warn that that's partly due to the prevalence of energy firms and financial firms in that Canadian S&P sample. But it's quite a striking contrast, I think, to the shifts that we're seeing in the United States. And so we can't really generalize about North America. We're seeing some differing shifts in Canada and the United States. We see also an increase in Europe when we look at the climate discussions, but also across industries where this really stands out. The biggest increase is in financials. So this is driven, a bit by banks, but mostly by insurance companies, or for the large banks, it's because they have insurance arms. And so insurance companies are, and have been for a long time, hugely concerned about the risks of climate, because for them, the risks clearly come from a changing world and a changing climate, and not from the climate regulation, climate policies that we adopt in response. So we can see it very clearly here. We also see it in the energy stocks as well, or energy companies as well, where there is an increase in discussion about climate. And I mentioned earlier on that there's a self-serving bias in the way that companies can talk about climate, and this can be as the instinct to cover their butt and deflect attention. So if they feel that they're going to be subject to criticism, they're going to talk most grandly. And so look, for example, at Shell and BP and energy companies that have very lofty things to say. Despite this year, we can see some quite disappointing actions that they've taken despite these claims. But it's clear that in terms of rhetoric, they lead the way. Utilities, we don't see quite as much in utilities, although just anecdotally from having read through a number of these reports on utilities, that's been a very interesting case to look at where for me, and I've not taken this bit further in this paper, but I see quite a big difference in utility companies in Europe compared to those in North America, and tremendous and a huge emphasis on renewables and language about climate in Europe. Some interesting developments as well. You see in some utility firms in Europe where the companies have chosen to split themselves into two entities, with one company then holding all of the dirty assets, which are usually coal-generating power facilities in South America. And then their European assets in Spain or Italy are the clean ones. And so probably a response to regulatory pressure so that the dirty one can be then secured in another jurisdictional location. So, but that, that's just an aside. But overall, so we see an increase in climate-related discourse. The greatest shifts that we identified were in both Canadian and European firms. We see an increase in energy transition optimism and moral frames, and that that's interesting to us because I think it gives us something to work with. Energy transition optimism, which is coupled with that technological opposition, it can be problematic, and so for example, discussions about carbon capture technology is also a debate about, well, are we just adopting these in order to extend the life of fossil fuels and avoid transition? So there are difficulties with that, but the energy transition, the increase in this energy transition optimism frame, I think opens up quite interesting political possibilities. We see energy and financials leading the way rhetorically. And however, the most cohesive frames are some of the older ones. Like, so for example, the anti-climate policy frame that emphasizes the costs of climate policy. So that type of frame is being eroded over time, but it's still quite strong. Outright adversarial framing is something we're seeing less of, and silence replaces skepticism, just as delay is replacing denial. So it's a shift in strategy and tactics. And the higher rates of climate-related risk elements that are identified in the reports, we see them in North America rather than Europe, with the exception of risks that are caused by climate change impacts. So this suggests to us that this risk reporting is really being driven by these regulatory structures, by the accountancy standards bodies, and by the fear of securities fraud litigation. Whereas in Europe, the identification of risks caused by climate change impacts is possibly due to a shift in perception of what is actually going on in the world, in a sense that this could impact. So I shall one further comment, and that is that the moral commitment frames, we might, at one point say, well, it's just a load of greenwash and nothing to get excited about. But one possibility that it does open up politically is that it leads to language that perhaps activist investors and shareholders can use to then hold the company to account through litigation or through other means of pressure. And so it's not entirely something to dismiss. And, I'll leave it there, and I invite your discussion.
What you see, but you hear anecdotally shifts in discourse, and attitudes of companies to see this subject to systematic research and compliments you going through 600 of these reports. You guys want to code these documents. But I think it's highly valuable to see also shifts, right, temporally and what jurisdictions do we see this, and so has this been published, this paper?
No, we're revising it to submit it, and so I'm really happy to get the chance to
Wonderful.
happy to get the chance to present it and discuss it.
So thank you for including us right at the cusp for this getting out, but I can definitely see that should be easy to publish, such very fundamental new data and analysis. Amy, I see you raised your hand. Want to start us off?
Thank you very much. I don't know if you can see me because I can only see the presentation in the room. So thank you very much, Laurie, for this very interesting presentation. I have a question that's sort of inspired by work that I myself am doing with a collaborator that looks at the perspectives of elites, economic elites. And in our research, we're looking at sort of coherence amongst people's thinking. So there's the literature that I'm sure you're familiar with on epistemic communities and advocacy coalitions. And I was wondering to what extent from your research, you're thinking about this group of individuals as having common ideas. So a lot of what you were researching were the frames and the frames chosen, and it comes from an angle of like how do they identify with these climate objectives, but how do you deal with the sort of the collective knowledge amongst them? So I was extremely excited to see that you're working with Kahneman and psychology and Entman with sociology, so that these give us insights into how people process ideas and how they frame it. But how about the sort of the essence of the knowledge of the expert? Thank you very much. I really appreciated the talk.
Thanks, Amy.
That's a great question. And what I'd love to do, and what we've not done because we don't have the resources for this bit, but certainly I hope can be a next step, is that I want to look at board composition. I think it's really important. I want to know who those people are and what their backgrounds are, because I think, this is what, coming to this research and when we started putting it together, one of the ideas at the back of my mind is that, it's really the world, worlds they inhabit, that matters a lot. And I think that and so it makes me think of research on board diversity, like gender diversity on boards, and the impact that that's had in Europe, for instance. Anecdotally, I'll just add also that before I started this research, and I was doing meeting with some energy executives in Calgary, and talked to an executive from Total, based in Calgary, and he made a comment that really struck me, and that is that there seem to be different worlds in the oil patch in Calgary that you could, get them all in a room, but the people from the European energy majors, so Shell, Total, BP, inhabit a completely different set of ideas than the smaller companies in the mid-cap smaller oil and gas companies that are either just operating in Canada or maybe operating in Canada and the United States. And I was really fascinated by this because back then I was trying to organize events for our European Union Center of Excellence, and we'd approach some people in industry, and if they had European connection, they'd sure, no problem, and they'd talk. I'd approach a smaller, like North American base or Canadian, and they treated me as if with huge suspicion, as if I was automatically the enemy. And I thought, this is very, very interesting. And it's a different world. And so I do think that's hugely important in the epistemic communities. That's something we don't have the data on. My hunch or my instinct was to approach it by looking through board biographies, because that's data we could collect. And I don't know what else in memberships or something else. I don't know, maybe you've got some suggestions for that. And so I guess my answer is yes, we think it's quite important, but we don't have a way to capture it yet.
Sorry, thank you very much. great talk and I learned a lot about talk. What I'm interested in is, do you see the correlation between moral faith and action faith in the annual report? For example, the company that say they acknowledge the urgent of climate change, do they also put in like we're willing to put more money, more budget into this project or this activity, and will not just acknowledge it's just moral and just let it all. Do you see this relation or the data as well?
I mean, I can't, I don't have that information at the firm level, but I can say generally how the analysis showed that they coalesced. And so that the action frames down a little bit differently. And so the what was interesting is that the moral commitment action frame, which I would be tempted to just dismiss as lofty words, actually had some action frame elements which I consider to be fairly meaningful. So the divestment, it's meaningful because it's measurable. It's and it's a fairly easy one to track as well and to evaluate. The organizational firm change I also think is meaningful, and so whether if a company actually creates a committee that reports to the board and that is monitoring its progress towards its declared goals and creating metrics for this, I think that over time it does change the culture of the organization a little bit. I mean, and the firm can vary in terms of how, to what extent it actually successfully achieves these measures. But I think the fact that they bothered to include this as a step, it can be an empty gesture, but there's a potential for meaningful change. But then with firm, the declaration of carbon or climate goals at the firm level, we found that with the energy transition optimism frame. So that's how we discovered empirically that we tended to bundle.
I mean, there's or in the room, I could give you a question which reflects what you already indicated in the talk, the issue of litigation and legal peril for these companies. Because if you talk to some climate activists, they would tell you actually litigation is the mechanism and the means through which we can actually hold these companies to account and change their course of action. I'm just wondering, how prominent was, the idea of legal recourse and legal threat, and in what way did it reflect different legal realities, environments in North America and in Europe? Right? And you briefly touched on this in your talk, because I think there's a different legal culture when it comes to the corporate world in North America and in Europe, right? And that I'm just wondering what kind of evidence you found through your discursive analysis. Well,
for the litigation that stems from the risk of litigation due to securities related fraud, that's we identified that as a North American development with North American impacts, because the securities fraud cases, and this is probably because the European Union already had these requirements for climate reporting that North America didn't have. But there were actually, so we see from 2007 until about 2015 that there are these cases in the United States, litigation undertaken, New York, California. There was a class action lawsuit in Texas related to securities fraud, related to failure to disclose. And then from that, you get a series of recommendations developed by accountancy bodies that they then release to companies saying, okay, you should follow these steps in order to minimize your risk of exposure to this type of litigation. We've also seen that in North America, law firms have released memos for companies that advise them. And so, for example, Osler released a memo to his Canadian clients, and so this is after 2015, to warning them that in the new legal setting, they need to balance the need to ensure that their climate risk disclosures meet the security disclosure requirements. But at the same time, they have to keep in mind that these disclosures can be used in court as evidence that companies emit greenhouse gas production contributes to harmful climate change. So basically saying, meet your requirements, but go no further, and don't say anything else. And so, this securities fraud litigation threats are most prevalent in Canada and the United States. And so we predicted that this is where we'd see this language relating to specific risks. And that's indeed what we find in the report, that there is, and it comes through even the structure of the report that's adopted, where they're very clear on those specific material risks related to climate. And we don't see that as much in Europe.
This is really interesting. I've got lots of questions. One, did you include or exclude or break out in any way B corporation?
All we did was we chose 3 different exchanges, TSX, S&P, and the Euro STOXX, because they were fairly comparable in terms of the size of market capitalization. We were able to draw the cases using on the same industry categories. So we just had to draw our firms.
Yeah.
What was your thinking about including or excluding issues focused on extraction, other than energy?
Well, what we were trying to do with our choice of these 5 different industry categories, and so we use, so utilities, industries, financials, energy, and consumer discretionary. We wanted to get some variation in terms of the type of climate exposure that they have. So we want to, and so obviously if you're an oil and gas company, you're kind of, you have major exposure. If you're a financial, you have major exposure. We wanted also, so we chose consumer discretionary, which would be, it could be a retail store or like car washes or, and because they, they're not obviously standing out on that spectrum. So we wanted variation across the type of exposure so that we could try to see what sort of impact that kind of maybe reflexive defensiveness on climate, what difference that might make.
So
Very good.
you want to roll?
All right. So I thought it about the moral framing and what kind of changes you might have seen in that area. That's very particular interest to me. And looking at sort of evolution of some kinds of international policies relating to fisheries and so forth, and the role that certain kind of ideas, in particular, for example, intergenerational equity, has sort of emerged as an important thing that you wouldn't have seen in the same way 10 years ago or earlier. And I just wondered if there are any trends that you noticed or could pick out.
Now we're limited by the coding framework that we have, and so to look at some of those, and so then maybe the more nuanced or types of ideas that might emerge, we'd have to do that through a separate analysis. But what we do identify in the moral framing, because we code the variables to allow us to identify changes in intensity, is the shift in intensity. And so if in 2013 we're seeing climate change mentioned, we tend to see by the later time period, we're seeing it mentioned as one of the most important problems facing the world, or in the chairman of the board statement or the CEO's statement on the beginning, they highlight it in their statement, or the entire report maybe is dedicated to the theme of climate and responding to climate. And so that's the it's so, I guess the intensity of the importance of highlighting this problem or this threat as an urgent and high priority problem.
Online, I think we have another 10 minutes before we need to get to lunch. Anyone online? Don't be shy. Okay. No, I'm not looking at you, Onia. There's some more.
Perhaps I could ask something. I'm not sure whether you have any, whether you realize any connections to popular consumption trends on the ground, because I'm thinking of some of the past talks and the relations towards perhaps trends in everyday retail, as you mentioned, like perhaps as the firms might see an economic opportunity in perhaps pioneering some green products like natural or local stuff, and how some perhaps populist, quote unquote, I use that term very cautiously here, in terms of just like the social media framings of how buying habits should transform to climate change, perhaps how the firms and the discourse is related or connected by that kind of sentiment.
Yeah, so we see, and I noticed, I read an awful lot of these reports, you very carefully from beginning to end, and so some of I have some examples to pull, but also general observations of what we found. And that is an increase in recognition of our customers demand this. And so there's an awareness that the world is changing. This is what people want from us. Now, especially looking at certain sectors like retail, for instance, we see an increased emphasis on things like circular economy. So recycling and reusing. And in the annual reports, this is discussed in terms of not only responding to what our customers expect of us in our social responsibility and our profile as this certain type of company, but it's also to save money. They're reducing their costs. And this is happening, and alongside this, typically you'll see this alongside the language that's emphasizing sustainability and attention to how ethical the sourcing is. So in that side, and so that's the side-by-side development. But circular economy is, at least for, and this is where some of the industry variations come in, because you don't see the same language used in utilities and energy as you do in the consumer discretionary, where it's an emphasis on materials, how they're used, how they're reused, and reducing the materials that they're using and the post-consumer waste.
Words. You were at the hands up at the very same time.
Thank you so much. It was quite useful, informative presentation, and also you made a lot of people going through 600 reports. Yeah. My question is not quite related to this topic, but it's a little bit general in terms of the climate change. One is the politics side, which the stakeholders, how they deal with that. I'm looking more the role of universities as a hubs of knowledge generation and knowledge transmission. What do you think that with this rapid environment, which is quite fastly changing in terms of climate and water resources, how do you find universities, are they really going aligned and producing the required knowledge for this century, and also the capacities which are required for the human resources capacities to tackle these problems? I'm sorry, it's not quite
Keeping up. I mean, that's
You get the very difficult questions before lunch.
I posed this one yesterday when I was meeting with the senior. Gosh, I don't know. I hope so. Yeah. I mean, you've hit the nail on the head that universities are going to be absolutely essential, because it's innovation, I think, that we desperately need. Are we generating enough of it? Well, I would just look to my own mother and say how disappointed by their priorities, how they've decided to spend the money with the most recent budget that just last week. But I'm an optimistic person, and I see that there is a huge growth as well in research on energy topics related to energy transition, both on the technological and technical side of it, as well as on the policy and the implementation. So scholars realize the urgency of this and have responded. And of course, we always need more resources directed at it because it's the most pressing challenge that we face.
Before we come to the last question, maybe just a quick add-on. Have you had any interest in your research, let's say from the corporate world or the policy world? Because I can, that's, how the feedback loop, right? You look at what they're doing, but they would also probably be interested in the kind of comparative perspective on the discourse that comes out of, these companies, right?
Yeah.
Particularly in Alberta, where you are, right?
Yes.
So, seems to be very timely.
I mean, this particular piece of research, we've not presented to a much broader audience yet, but some of our other research I do work together with industry in some research. So I'm working on a project on electricity grid transition in Alberta, and we're working with utility companies in that, and we're quite interested in how transition is related to the political polarization of some of these issues. So, and as we try to electrify and, there's this encouragement for us to buy Teslas and solar panels. Is this something that is, seen as something that opportunity is exploited only by the wealthy, and it leaves the others to pick up the tab for, a changing grid? And interesting political science questions, and industry is certainly very concerned about and interested in those questions as well.
Okay, so last question.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm just curious about the method of analysis, kind of. And I see that you kind of study European companies. I'm wondering, what about European companies that maybe publish their reports in languages other than English, maybe German? Do you consider those, or all the European companies you kind of put that at the day of publish that stuff with their statements in English? And did you kind of analyze these statements with some kind of technological software, or like was it analyzed by you?
So we used the reports that we used were all in English, and when we were doing our case selection, we did have to drop a few cases, but actually not very many, because they were not because the reports that we relied upon were not published in English, and so that happened with the few, I think, the Portuguese. It was actually quite a limited problem. It did not have a very large impact on the sample. So that answers your question.
So that was actually the second last.
Last question. What do you think is the most important implication for social movement or for activists that can take from the research? Yeah. You mentioned some, I remember that. That's asking to extend this.
Okay, like entry points, right? For
I think the language, and so the opening up of language. So two different opportunities. And so we see the growth in both the technical optimism frame as well as the moral frame. So the moral frame provides for an opportunity for activism to hold companies to their public declarations, because I think there's certainly that's certainly an avenue for pressure. The technical optimism frame, I think, opens up opportunities for new coalitions and new partnerships. And so you have a company that, and with a technical optimism frame, you don't even need the company to think that for moral reasons, we need to, we need to adopt better climate policies. It's enough for them to think that they can make some money in it. And that's an opportunity to get them behind the policies that are going to help and to maybe to build coalitions that can maybe pressure government for investment incentives and opportunities, because that, I think, signals a readiness to back that type of strategy.
Important last question, thank you. And congratulations on your research, and we look forward, good luck with publicizing this. It's been a real pleasure having you here for the last 3 days, Lori, and we keep our connection across the Rockies, and you're always welcome back here, to present some more of it. Fascinating research. Thank you.